Hi, everybody. Ian Bremmer here, and a quick take over the weekend, yet again, because there is entirely too much blowing up around the world here. I want to focus on Syria, where just a few hours ago, Bashar Assad, the dictator, overthrown by a large number of militarily strong opposition forces led by the radical Islamist group HTS. A lot to talk about here. This whole thing lasted less than 2 weeks. And initially, the Russians and the Iranians provided military support for Assad, but his complete inability of his army to fight and offer resistance and the distraction that the Russians have, the stretch thin from their fighting in Ukraine, from the Iranians providing support to a resistance forces that are doing very badly against Israel, particularly Hezbollah and Lebanon, meant there wasn't all that much capacity or even that much political will to provide support. And so Assad has been overthrown. By itself, that's good news in the sense that this has been an incredibly repressive regime fighting initially a war against their own people, pro-democracy movement that came out of the Arab Spring and has led to over 500,000 Syrians dead over the last decade, over 200,000 of them civilians, and some 6 million refugees, both fleeing into neighboring Arab states, but also into Europe, into Turkey, and of course into Germany, which is part of the reason that Merkel ended up leaving her terms in ignominy. That is the initial background, and there has been a lot of support for various opposition groups in Syria, from Turkey, most notably from the UAE, from Saudi Arabia, and from the United States, while the Assad government was being supported principally by the Russians in terms of air support, some intelligence, some cyber capabilities, and from the Iranians on the ground, particularly the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps. And that was largely enough through the majority of this war. The rebel groups by 2018 had retreated into the northwest, this Idlib region. And by that point, the rebels that were left were mostly led by ISIS. And that meant, a common enemy on the part of the United States and Turkey had turned from Assad to, the proximate Syrian part of the war on terror. And if that had failed, it had the potential to turn Syria and neighboring Iraq into a terrorist state. ISIS lost that battle. Assad consolidated most of Syria under his regime. And then about 4 years ago, Turkey and Russia brokered a ceasefire in Idlib, which was at that point under opposition control. That brings us to today. And to HTS, which stands for Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. It's a former al-Qaeda affiliate in Syria that has since formally cut their ties with the terrorists, but they're still called a terrorist organization, labeled one by the United States and its allies in NATO, and they are the de facto leader of the armed opposition and led the now ouster of Assad. Now, they've become kind of Hezbollah-like in the sense that they're providing a lot of Syrian citizens with government services. They've managed to coordinate, sort of rebels and eliminate infighting underneath that. And they've also promised to protect Syrian Christians and Muslim Alawites and have gotten the tacit support of the Turkish Erdogan government, who basically gave them at least a blinking yellow, if not a green light, to go ahead and launch this war against Assad 2 weeks ago. Now, having said all of that, the likelihood that they're going to run, as a secular government, Syria seems unlikely to me. We're going from Assad to what is probably going to be a radical Islamist government that'll be repressive and that'll be deeply challenging. And so I don't think that is in any way at least at this point, something that we can call a transition that's good news, or that we shouldn't feel anxiety about. But what is clear is that the Iranians and Russians have lost. So the axis of resistance is not looking like much of an axis, and it's not putting up very much resistance. The Russians, Putin has said nothing about this. He's not made a public statement. And that's not surprising. I mean, frequently when he is surprised and he faces sudden embarrassing losses, he doesn't say anything about it to his people. And if you look at Russian state media, they've been talking about France and South Korea and Trump and all those things, but almost no coverage of Syria, where the Russians have lost an ally and they've lost a military base that's important to them in Tartus. And, they've not been able to put up much of a fight. Now, the good news there is that if you're Putin, you should be more cognizant of the fact that there are major costs of continuing to fight an incredibly bloody war in Ukraine, where you're making some gains, but you're losing huge numbers of Russian citizens. And so if Trump is coming in and says he wants to cut a deal, Putin should be more incented to do that. There's also good news on the Iranian front, in the sense that Syria falling means that they no longer have a corridor to provide military support for Hezbollah. And that means that the 2-month ceasefire, which has been announced by the Israelis and by the Lebanese government, is more likely to hold. Now, if you put those two things together, kind of interesting, looks more likely that Trump gets inaugurated and he is indeed able to announce that the temporary ceasefire becomes a permanent end of the war between Israel and Hezbollah, and that he's able to negotiate a ceasefire between the Russians and Ukrainians that does not give up the store to Putin. The former is an easier bet than the latter, but both of them certainly look more likely on the back of Assad being ousted. The bad news, more challenges, more humanitarian degradation for the Syrian people on the ground. Could easily see another million refugees on the back of the fighting that we've had, depending on what happens with governance going forward. There are very few hospitals that are presently functioning. There is very limited humanitarian aid on the ground that's necessary in very short order, and it's hard to say that fighting isn't going to break out amongst the various factions that have held together in fighting a common enemy. If that's going to lead to coherent governance going forward, depends so much on what happens when HTS becomes not the leader of a rebel group, but suddenly is responsible for governance on the ground in Syria. And, your guess is as good as anyone as to what is going to happen there. So that is the best I can tell where we are right now. It's a fascinating issue and an temporary expansion of the war in the Middle East, but hopefully one that we can see bringing a little bit of stability to some other conflicts that are happening in the region and more broadly. That's it for me, and I'll talk to you all real soon.